absolute favorite parables is the parable of the sower. I've preached from this parable many times before. But when I usually do, I preach from Matthew chapter 13, which I don't know why, but that's usually where I go to whenever I preach from the parable of the sower. This week, though, I was reading in Mark, and I happened to read this parable in Mark chapter 4. So that's where we're going to go this morning. Mark chapter 4. We're going to start in verse 3. Jesus is speaking, and he says, "Listen, behold, the sower went out to sow. And it happened, as he sowed, that some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds of the air came and devoured it. Some seed fell on stony ground, where it did not have much earth. And immediately it sprang up, because it had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, it was scorched. And because it had no root, it withered away. And some seed fell among thorns. And the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no crop. But other seed fell on good ground, and yielded a crop that sprang up, increased and produced, some 30-fold, some 60, and some 100. And Jesus said to them, He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Now, it may seem strange to us, maybe even a little wasteful, but what Jesus is describing by talking about this sower is the farmer who's going out into his field and planting his crop. Now, what he's describing also is the accepted way for a farmer of his day to do that very thing. He would have a big bag that had his seed in it, and he would go out onto the land where he was going to plant his crop, and he would take a handful of seed and he would sow it out by hand. And so, without having the modern farming implements that we have today, where one kernel of corn is planted every so many inches and so many inches apart, where it's very scientific and precise, it was done in a way that we would sometimes think there could have been a better way to do this. But that was the way that it was done in that time. And in fact, not only was the seed hand broadcast or sown that way, but it was also broadcast on top of soil that then you had to come back and plow at a later date. And because of that, you didn't know what might be under the ground. You didn't know how deep the soil was where you were planting your seeds. As you were sowing your seeds, some of it would certainly fall among the weeds that were there on that piece of ground. But then, just like the seeds, they would all be plowed and tilled up. That was just the common way, the accepted way, the prescribed way of planting in first century Palestine. That's the way it had been done. That's still the way that it's done in some parts of the world today. While it may seem strange to us, what Jesus was telling his listeners was understood perfectly by them. Now, we could spend much time, and this is, I think, one of the reasons that I love this particular parable. We could spend much time on each part of this parable here this morning. And we could look at the steadfastness that's involved in the work of sowing the seed, and the faith that the farmer has as he broadcasts the seed. We could talk about the power of the seed itself to bring about change in the land in which it's being planted. And of course, and I had before, but we could certainly talk about the types of soils that are encountered by this farmer as he goes through and as he plows the seed into the ground. But our focus this morning is going to be not on the whole picture of the parable, but on one specific type of soil that Jesus describes. And that type of soil is found in verses 18 through 19. Now, the great thing about this parable is that Jesus goes on and he gives an explanation for what this parable is. He tells his disciples, this is kind of a hidden thing, but because you are my disciples and because you need to know about the kingdom of God, I'm going to tell you what's here in this parable so that you can then understand how to hear and how to interpret the parables that are to come. We're going to start in verse 19. We're going to get down and focus on 18 and 19, but we're going to start in verse 13. Verse 14, I'm sorry. Verse 14, Jesus says, the sower sows the word. These are the ones by the wayside where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan comes immediately, takes away the word that was sown in their hearts. These likewise are the ones sown on stony ground, who, when they hear the word, immediately receive it with gladness. And they have no root in themselves, and so endure only for a time. Afterward, when tribulation or persecution arises for the word's sake, immediately they stumble. Now these are the ones sown among the thorns. They are the ones who hear the word, and the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, the desire for other things entering in, choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. But these are the ones sown on good ground, those who hear the word, accept it, and bear fruit. Some 30, some 60, some 100. Go back and look at verses 18 and 19 again. These are the ones sown among the thorns. And Jesus says, this is what it looks like for one of those people who has the word of the gospel sown into their life, but it's sown among the thorns, among the weeds, among the brambles. And yes, all of that has gotten plowed under. But we all know that simply because you plow a weed under, or simply because you dig it up, if you don't get all the root, it doesn't necessarily kill that weed. It can come back again and continue to grow. Well, that's what Jesus is describing here. Verse 18, these are the ones sown among the thorns. They are the ones who hear the word. And that word hear in Greek is a very interesting word. It doesn't just mean they receive information through their ear. It means that they hear it and they act upon it. We would say hear and obey, because for us, as Westerners, that's two separate things. Because we know that sound waves have penetrated and vibrated our eardrum, and we have heard something, but it doesn't mean that we always act upon that. Any of you who have ever been a kid, do I have anybody here who's ever been a kid before? Yeah, I thought maybe. Any of you who have ever been a kid before, and you're laying in your bed, and you know that it's getting close to time to get up, because you can hear the household starting to wake up and starting to stir. And you know that at some point, very soon, you're going to hear a voice coming from the other end of the house, or from the hallway. It's time to get up, get your clothes on, and get to the table. We know anyone here who's ever been a kid has had this experience. They've had an adult call them to the breakfast table. It might be a cold morning. The floor is cold. And you're in your warm bed. You don't really want to get up. You can hear the sounds, but you make the choice not to respond to that. We have a distinction in our language for that. Jesus does not make a distinction here. The word hear, the way it's used in the Greek and in the Hebrew, means that you both hear and respond. You hear the words that are being spoken, and you immediately respond to what you hear. You do it. You hear what's being said, you get up, and you go immediately. That's how these folks have received the gospel. They have heard it. But it's not just the argument for why you should believe that they've heard. They have heard the gospel. And they have received that gospel. They have believed upon it. They have placed their faith in what they hear. They are believing what God tells them here. Now, these folks, Jesus says, verse 18, these are those folks who like this. They've received that word. They hear this word. Verse 19, the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, the desires for other things entering in, choke the word, and that word becomes unfruitful. It's clear from Jesus' parable that these thorns are present in this life, and they have grown up. These weeds, these thorns have grown up along with that word that has been received. Jesus is obviously describing a person here who has heard and received the word of truth, and that word of truth has taken root in that person's life. And along with the seed of the word of God's truth, there are other things that are growing up as well, things that Jesus describes as thorns or weeds. And if these thorns and weeds are allowed to continue, they will choke out. They will keep that seed of faith from maturing and bearing fruit the way that God intends it to do. This morning, what I want us to do is to take a look at these thorns that are mentioned here by Jesus. The cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, and the desires for other things. And the way that Luke says it in his gospel, when he tells this parable, by the way, instead of desires for other things, Luke has a phrase that says pleasures of life. Now, as we look at these things, you may be surprised at how easy it is for these weeds and thorns to be present. You might be surprised, like I was, at how easy it is for these things to go unnoticed as they grow in our lives. The first thing that Jesus talks about here are the cares of this world. And these cares, the Greek word can also mean distractions. So these cares, or these distractions that he describes as weeds or thorns, these are those things which can appear to be so good and so important to us, but they actually take our attention and our focus away from the things of God. You may remember me talking about, and pastors before me talking about, the two realities. We have a higher reality, a faith reality of those things that of God that we can know by faith and only are supposed to know by faith. And then we have the lower reality. Those things that are just a part of our everyday life. Those things that we know in this world that we can know by our senses. You've heard me talk about it another way, the reality of faith, the reality of sight. But it's not just sight that we know the world around us. It's also through all the rest of our senses. The reality of faith refers to those things that deal with God and His eternity. These things are not known by our senses. But these things are learned. They are known and understood as we walk with God, as we continue in our relationship with Him, as we keep our faith in Jesus, as we mature in that relationship. The things of this lower reality are constantly growing old, are constantly going into a state of decay. The things of this lower reality constantly go away. But the things of God's reality, the higher reality, those are things that are eternal. Those are things which last. These lower reality things can seem so important to us. I mean, when we talk about our jobs, when we talk about our hobbies, our cars, our homes, even our kids' activities, all of these things can seem so important to us and can consume so much of our time. But the importance of the things of this life pales in comparison to how important the things of God are. Unfortunately, because we depend so much on our senses as we live in this world, we often get distracted from the reality of God by these temporary things that fill our lives. Or worse yet, we attempt to know God through our senses, and we try to drag eternity and the things of faith down into this world that we know by our senses. And we try to experience God through our feelings, through our emotions, through touching Him in some way. This is the wrong way to know God. Scripture very clearly tells us that we are to know God by faith. And it is by faith that we know the things of God and continue in that relationship with Him. So this first thing that we talk about, the cares of this world, we realize that the cares of this world can seem so important, and yet the cares of this world pass away so quickly. Those things that we cared so intently and so passionately about 5 years ago, today may not seem so meaningful to us. Things change in our lives. The cares of this world change. And if we devote all of our time and all of our energy and all of our focus taking care of the cares of this life, we will have no time to focus our life upon the things of God. The second thing that Jesus mentions is the deceitfulness of riches. I want to quote a theologian by the name of Albert Barnes here at this point, because he says, or we could word it this way: the way in which a desire to be rich deceives us. So it's not just the riches, he says, that are deceitful. It's the desire that we have to be rich that is deceptive. This pursuit of riches, again, takes away our time and our attention from the things of God. Because there are so many today who are pursuing after riches, we dismiss many opportunities to think about and to examine the maturity of our Christian relationship. Riches have a way of enticing us. They promise to give us those things that we don't have, and those things that we think we need so desperately. Yet this promise is an empty one. Riches don't make us happy. And even when riches are gained, there's no guarantee of happiness. There are many unsatisfied and unhappy rich people in this world today. And that's not just a poor person telling you that. That's usually that's what I think. Oh, well, anyway. I saw an interview with an ex-NFL player, an ex-football player, a number of years ago, who had retired from playing football. And he now spent his time going in and talking to rookies who were coming into the NFL. And one of the things that he told them, he said, many of you, like me, when I first entered into the NFL, he said, many of you come from a background where you grew up with nothing. He went on to tell the story. He talked about how, as a young man, his mom raised him. He said, I lived with my mom and my grandma. He said, we lived in a little 2-bedroom house. He said, it was shocking how poor we were. He said, the first thing that I did when I got my first paycheck from the NFL was I went out and I bought a house for my mom. A lot of players do that. And he went on and he said, you are about to have more money than you have ever imagined having in your lifetime. He said, as far as everybody else is concerned, you have hit the big time. But having money, and this is my favorite part of this whole quote from him, having money does not make you a better person. Having money makes you more of what you already are. I thought, wow, that's insightful. This is coming from a person who has been there, who, and if you look over the life and the career of the player I'm talking about, Chris Carter, who played for the Vikings for years, you'll see that he struggled in a lot of areas in his life. One of the biggest areas he struggled with was this area of having money and using it unwisely. And now he's come to the point in his life where he is trying to pass on the hard-earned wisdom that he has to those players who are brand new to the NFL. Hopefully, as he's throwing the seeds of his wisdom out into their lives, hopefully some of it is sticking. Riches are deceitful, and that they bring no real satisfaction. There is an ongoing desire to possess more wealth. You never have enough. At what point does it become enough? Never. I believe someone once asked, I don't think it was Donald Trump, but it was another one similar, another real estate person similar to Donald Trump. At what point do you say that you own enough property? And this person said, I'll never own enough property. As long as there's still property out there for me to buy, I'll never have enough. That's the deceitfulness of riches. Finally, one more way that riches are deceitful is because they offer a false sense of security and peace. The amount of money that we have in our bank accounts or in our retirement accounts or even hidden in our mattress is no substitute for the peace that comes from serving and knowing God. If this weed, known as the love of money, is allowed to grow in our life, surely the word that has been received by faith will be choked out, and every desire to follow God by faith in Jesus will be destroyed. The last thing that Jesus talks about are the desires for other things. And as I read that phrase, I wonder if Jesus had Christians today in the 21st century in mind when he said the desires for other things. If ever there was a time in history that was filled with ways to be distracted, it is today. The average, The average attention span of a person today has gotten so small that, seriously, if we are doing anything that takes more than about 6 or 7 minutes, it seems like it's taking an eternity. If I have to make popcorn any other way than in the microwave, I'm probably not going to make popcorn. If I can't throw a bag of popcorn in there and hit the button and walk away from it, why would I bother? Why would I get out a pan and oil and actual corn and put it in there? It tastes a whole lot better when you make it on the stove. But it takes so long. Someone told me that when you look back in history and you see how long a famous preacher like John Wesley preached, it wasn't uncommon for him to preach an hour or more. That's not the entire service. That's the sermon. Go back and read some of the readings. If you want to get newer than John Wesley, go back and read Spurgeon. Go back and read some of the American guys from back in the late 1800s and some of the sermons that they wrote. I have books of those sermons, and some of those sermons are 15 to 20 pages long. And many of those sermons are the Sunday evening sermons that they were preaching. Those weren't even the Sunday morning sermons. Part of that is what television has done to us over the last 15 years. We've become conditioned to have 30-second sound bites. Well, a few years ago it was 30 seconds. It's probably a lot less than now. A lot less than that now. We look for that out of a 10-minute sermon, 15-minute sermon. We look for that one sentence that's going to stick with us and it's going to get us through this next week. Because that's what we have been conditioned to do. We live in such a distracted age. We have our phones, our cars, our jobs, our TVs, our books, our magazines, our computers. We have more ways than any generation before us to distract our minds from being quiet so that we may hear the still, small voice of God. My nephew Heath, who, when he was stationed down at Fort Hood, he and his wife were here. Many of you remember Heath and Chelsea. When Heath got out of the Army, he moved back to Oklahoma. He went to work for his father-in-law. And in going to work for his father-in-law, he told me that one of the things that he was looking so forward to doing was to get to work the land again. To go out and to take care of his father-in-law's cattle, to go and plant fields, to ride in the tractor. He said, that is just really good time for me to be alone. He said, it's time for me to think, it's time for me to process and to deal with things. I said, that's marvelous. We all need more time like that in our lives. So I asked him about it, I think at Christmas last time I saw him. I said, so are you still enjoying that quiet time? He said, what I'm really loving is this new tractor because it's GPS guidance enabled. And he said, all I do is put in the coordinates and how much, where we're plowing and what we're going to do. He said, I don't even touch the steering wheel. I don't touch the throttle. I don't do anything. He said, I sit in this air-conditioned cab and I have my phone and I watch movies all day long. I'm so glad you had your quiet time. It was crazy. It was just crazy. But that's the kind of world that we live in. We have more ways to distract us than any other time, and all of these other things distract us from God. Many of the shows, along with these distractions they bring, many of the shows we watch, or the songs we hear, the books we read, plant images and thoughts in our mind that can really cause damage to the growing seed of the gospel in our lives. There is no way that I can name all of the distractions that each of us face every day, but I can tell you, personally, I find it almost impossible to do something as nice and as pleasant as sit on the sofa for 30 minutes in the evening with my wife without grabbing my phone to check email or to play a game. I can't sit for 30 minutes without doing that. How sad is that? It's terrible, and I know it, and I'm sorry. It's pitiful. That's a weed that I've allowed to grow up in the garden of my life. And it's a weed that needs to be dealt with. And that will be dealt with. The time to deal with the weed either a weed in our yard or a weed in our life, is when that weed is first spotted. If we wait even a short time, one weed has a way of becoming dozens or even hundreds of weeds. God has shown me some weeds in my life that need to be pulled up and dealt with right away. But how about you? Has God been pointing out things to you this morning? Those weeds, those things that have become distractions in your relationship with Him? If He has, deal with that weed immediately, before it has time to choke out the spiritual fruit that God wants to produce in each of our lives. Sean, let's sing this morning. Come and lead us in our final hymn. I'm going to invite you, as always, these altars are always open for you to come and pray.